Kubernetes for Humans.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Kubernetes for Humans podcast. Today, with me in the show, we have Ellen. Ellen, can you please introduce yourself?
Absolutely. I'm happy to be here today. My name's Olin Chisa, and I'm a partner at Boldstart Ventures. We're inception investors in a bunch of early stage companies that you might have heard of, and some that have moved along and are much bigger, like Sneak, Big ID, and Superhuman. In particular, we love working with technical founders from the very beginnings of their companies. And so that means we get to see a lot of what people are thinking about on the cutting edge of infrastructure in Kubernetes.
So, Ellen, becoming a VC is always like an interesting tale, but you are a VC in a super technical, infra-based VC. So maybe share about the journey. How did life set you up there?
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny. If you think 5 years ago, I think the path makes a lot of sense. And if you looked at my career 10 years ago, you would never guess that I would be an infrastructure investor. But before I joined Boldstart, I was the co-founder of a company called Dark. And what we built was actually kind of funny to be on a Kubernetes podcast talking about this, but we were trying to build an application layer programming language that would completely abstract over cloud infrastructure. And so our whole thesis was, hey, most developers should just be writing their application level code and everything else should basically just be compiled under the hood and they shouldn't have to think about it at all. And so...
Any dude of, together with the dude of Circle CI,
yeah,
right?
My co-founder was Paul, who co-founded Circle CI prior to Dark. And so he kind of came at it from this angle of this, what if we took CI/CD to the logical end conclusion of it being fully instantaneous all of the time?
Yeah, sorry, I cut you off. So you were there?
Yeah. So we were building that super interesting space. I'm sure we'll get into that more. But Boldstart had been investors in Dark, the company. And so I'd gotten to know them from the side of being a founder. And so I just knew how much more the team was excited and involved with working with technical founders. Ed and Elliot, my partners, were two of the first people to use a cloud programming language, which I don't know how familiar your listeners are, but most of the time as a VC, you're not writing code. You might do some on the side for fun. But them just having spent the time to kind of ramp up and want to write small applications and try it out was really a strong signal to me that they really cared about technology. And they're also just in it with us the whole time. And I feel like so much of the startup business is humans and so much of engineering in general. And so from that standpoint, it really set me up after I left. We all knew we liked working together and wanted to spend more time doing that.
And then basically that's it, or there was another stop between
it was
the dot.
So after I left Dark, I took a little bit of time off, as I feel like most founders do. I think it's something more of us should do, is kind of take time to say, hey, I thought really hard about this interesting business or this interesting technical problem for 4 years. I kind of need to refresh my brain and think about what I want that next time to be spent on. And so I had a little bit of time to do that. And when I joined the team, I was actually still very undecided about if I wanted to start another infrastructure company and if I saw a different gap in the market than Dark fulfilled, if I was more interested in kind of being part of the community and helping a lot of different companies, or if I was excited to invest. And so when I came out and joined the team, it was as a founder in residence, and I kind of had leeway to do any of those. And then what started happening was I just kept finding really exciting founders that I wanted to work with. And I was excited about their vision for the next 10 years. And I didn't necessarily have my own vision about what the next 10 years of infrastructure would be that was narrow enough that I thought it was the right company to build.
It's super interesting to be in the middle of all of those founders saying that they are going to change the future of infrastructure, right? And go to you to raise money. And so, usually most of our listeners are platform engineers, DevOps, people who like Kubernetes. And even before Boldstart, you are in Dark, and I think it's 7 years ago, something like that. So maybe if you can share a bit on what changed, right, in those 7 years that you see in the industry. When you founded Dark, back then, I remember there was a lot of buzz because I think mainly all of the Circle CI and so on. So I remember even myself looking into it and saying, that looks quite cool. But I feel that the industry is changing quite a lot, and Kubernetes maybe makes some things going to production a bit easier. But if you can share about what is the biggest changes that you're seeing from founding Dark to now?
Yeah, I might answer it opposite way, because the things that came to me, I feel like the more that changes, the more that stays the same. And so I think
What?
one thing that has really stayed consistent, even as things have changed under the hood, is everyone is still really looking for that experience that we had with Heroku and kind of right around that like pre-2010 era. And everyone just wants it to be like, hey, this is like the one thing you set up. And so almost everyone I talk to who's in infrastructure is really still thinking about, hey, how do we get back to this like one-click thing where it just works and we don't have to worry about it too much? So I think what's changed is kind of the ways that people are looking at getting to that. And so I think like a good example of that is even just saying platform engineering teams. When we started Dark, I don't think anyone was really talking about platform engineering teams. Like I think I like had talked to a couple people where I was like, oh, we're thinking about hiring this infrastructure person internally. And one of the titles we threw out for it was platform engineer, which definitely wouldn't have been what most platform engineering teams are now. So that was like just starting to enter the zeitgeist. And so that's one big piece is we've kind of said, hey, developer experience is something that really matters, and we're going to try to enable people to have a better developer experience internally. I think on top of that, we've also gotten a much bigger wave of ways to track that. And so when I think about companies like DX or like Quotient, we're starting to see these companies that are really centered around developer experience that have kind of helped popularize more of the frameworks. Like we had Dora, and then we had Space, and we have the internal developer surveys. But I think we're trying to find more and more sophisticated ways to look at if we're actually making developers' lives better with the infrastructure we build and the platforms we build internally. So I think that professionalization of the space is something that's definitely new and different. And then I think there's something that's a trend around how we think about the work that we do. And so I think for a long time, there was kind of a glorification or like a single, like, I'm the hero who is saving the infrastructure all of the time. And what I've seen now is there's been a lot more work around wanting to enable individual developers to have more of an impact as well. And so it's not that we have to call the same person every time it goes wrong. It's that, hey, let's equip individuals with tracing information that would help them find a root cause themselves. Let's give them self-serve tools so they don't have to reach out to us every time they want to change something. And so I feel like there's a lot more around empowerment rather than kind of keeping the power over infrastructure consolidated in a small, very sophisticated team.
Sorry, everything that you mentioned sounds super optimistic. Like, we're going to a lot of good direction. Maybe share a bit about the downside or if there's any. Like 7 years ago, were things simpler? Were people happier? Like, what are the things or like, what do you see as like the main challenges or like challenges and that platform engineers or DevOps or infrastructure engineering are facing today that maybe they didn't have? Or like, what is the dark side, if any, right?
Yeah.
For things that you mentioned.
For sure. And I think this was also true in 2017. But I think there's a book I really like called The Plenitude, which is a pretty philosophical book. But it was written in the time where it's kind of like, oh, we make cereal bowls, then we make specific cereal spoons, and then we make specific glasses to drink cereal milk out of. And it's sort of like everything you invent requires you to invent 5 other things around it. In that book, it was very much about we fill our houses with random objects. But I feel like the same thing is true about infrastructure technology. Every piece of technology we invent, we then make something to make it easier. So maybe we have infrastructure as code, and then we have infrastructure as code management, and then, or like we have a data warehouse, and we have a data lake, and we have ETL, and like we keep adding more layers onto the tooling that we have to think about as engineers. And I think that's something that makes it somewhat hard to make a good decision about what to use. And so the way I think about that for platform engineers and for DevOps people is like we should always be thinking about what is the core problem we are looking to solve for our users and what is the approach that is best to solve that. I think it's very tempting to be like, oh, this thing is like cool and new and shiny, and so I want to try it out because my friend is talking about it, or I want to be the first one on the block to use it. But I think when we do that, we get further away from what we're actually trying to do with our jobs, which is make things better. And so like every time I'm talking to a startup, I'm telling them to think about what pain are you solving for someone. And anytime I'm talking to like a buyer or a user of technology, I'm kind of to say like, hey, what is it you actually want to happen here when you use this?
No, that sounds super relevant for the same things that I'm also seeing. And I think the marketing is feeling. So man, we don't have a lot of VCs. I think like you're the first VC that came to the podcast. So I'd be happy maybe if you can share a bit about that. You're a VC. I'm a ex-developer, right? Like I know the code. I know the space because I was a DevOps, let's say, in eBay. I really was. When I come to pitch you with an idea, right? What are the things that interest you? Why should maybe what idea do I need in order to leave my day job as a platform engineer in a super successful company and come to Boldstart and raise money? Like, what are you looking at? And what are the criteria? What are the trends maybe or things that you are looking to
Yeah,
invest?
for sure. I think the biggest thing I end up talking to engineers about, I think, is engineers were often a little bit sheltered from the revenue stream of the business. We have a specific set of technical problems we're trying to solve. And so we can have something that we're like, oh, I built this and it's useful. And there's the delta between I built this and it's useful and this could be a business. And then the delta between this could be a business that like some of my friends would buy, or like I can make enough to support myself on a salary, and this would be a venture-backed outcome. And so the first thing I usually end up talking to people about who are kind of saying, hey, I think I might want to start a company, is sort of figuring out where what they want to build falls on that spectrum. And so if you're going to go talk to a VC, you should have in your head how you think you would eventually be making $100 million a year on this business. And so like one easy proxy for that is, who do you think the first company that would pay you $1 million for this product is? Like if you think the company that you're working at would pay that much externally to acquire a service to solve all these problems, that's like a great starting point. So that's one option for how to think about it. The other option that I'll sometimes run through with people is you could think about how would what you're building eventually acquire one of the large companies in the space. Like you come in and you say, hey, this is going to be huge. We're going to be bigger than Wiz. Like that's going to get a VC's attention right away, because like we don't hear about things like that very often. Is you want to think about, is this big enough? And then after that, I think the big things investors are looking at, this is going to vary a lot, investor by investor. But for me and for Boldstart, we are always talking to technical folks, which is great. One of the things that I like about that is you don't necessarily have to think about, can this person build this? If you've been building part of the platform machine at like a large respected company that has great DevOps practices, I'm not like, hey, can you write some code? Like we don't need to talk about that at all. I don't need to know much about like the full bio of every job you've ever had, because I believe you, I've read your LinkedIn, I know about that. I'm more interested in what is the problem you want to solve and like what's your hypothesis for the first way you're going to solve it. And so the way that usually looks is someone saying, hey, this is the big problem. This is how we're getting to the long-term vision. But the first thing I want to ship in the next, say, 6 months, 12 months is this specific product. And these are like the types of the 3 to 5 design partners, specifically who within those companies would care by, say, job title, or even frankly, if they're people in your network, by name, the people you're excited about working with. And then who you want to bring onto your team to be able to do that. A huge part of being a founder is the team you're able to build around you. And so having that idea of like, these are the shapes of people, these are specific people I've worked with before, this is what my co-founding team will be like, is also important.
No, that makes total sense. And why do people, maybe like I will ask a couple of questions. So maybe like question number one is, what areas are you currently seeing that are most interesting for you? Like as a VC, like what are the hot trends? Should I just open like a Gen AI security company and raise a lot of money? Should I do some other buzzword? Like what are the trends? What should I do?
Yeah, I think what I want to see and what are trends are two different things. So I think one thing that definitely happens is there are often trends that we'll see. And so like Gen AI is a great example of one. And there's been evolution of this over time. So if we would have had this podcast last summer, pretty much every developer who came in who wanted to pitch me a Gen AI company was saying, I'm going to automatically generate unit tests, or I'm going to automatically generate like pull review. Pull request descriptions for review. And frankly, neither of those are that differentiated, and the pain isn't high enough. Like, sure, none of us really like writing a great description, but at the end of the day, like people get it done. It's fine. This is more of a feature that could exist within GitHub than a true product. And so that's sort of what you see when you see a new technology wave coming out. I would say now we're seeing a lot more around what is the infrastructure? How do you make it easier to train a model? How do you verify that the prompt changes you're making are actually having an impact on your end customer experience? So kind of little infrastructure pieces around generative AI experience for developers. From my standpoint, I'm still happy to see those companies, and maybe someone will come up like, that's why you're a VC, is you don't have the approach that you think is going to make it as a huge outcome company. And so I'm very happy to hear people taking different approaches. But my hypothesis is that we're not going to know exactly what infrastructure to build for those products until we know what the killer applications are. And so from that standpoint, when I think about generative AI, I'm very interested in teams that are kind of saying, hey, this is the infrastructure shift that I think we're going to have. And related to that, I think this is the first application. And like, I have a novel way of how we can build that company, kind of working on both of those pieces at the same time. Another thing I would note is, because there are trends that happen over time, you sometimes will see a lot of like very well qualified teams working on the same problem. One of those I would say that's definitely happening right now that's relevant to platform engineers is around non-human identity. So it's sort of a platform security team overlap where people are saying, oh, I have all of these automated service accounts that are connected to my cloud accounts. I don't know what all of them are. Some of them have left. Some of the people who used to maintain them have left my company. And so that's definitely an issue. I think people are saying it's about 50-1 to human accounts. But when I look at that and I say, oh, I've seen 10, 20 equally qualified great teams all going after the same problem, it's very hard to say I'm going to bet on this team unless that's a team you've already worked with or you have some unfair advantage knowing about what they're going to do. And so when you start seeing that, you start going like, yeah, we're definitely going to get technological innovation in this category, but you still might not make a bet. What I really like seeing is teams who are approaching something that's kind of a little bit unexpected, but when you start calling around to their customer base, the customers go, yes, sign me up, I'll pay for it right now. And especially if it's not people they brought in as references, if I start calling people in my network and I'm like, hey, met this interesting founder, they're thinking about this problem, and the person's like, I've never seen anything like this. This has been like one of my top 3 priorities for the year. Can I talk to them? And they're like trying to get the intro to the founder. That's when I know we really have something interesting.
Give me a couple of examples, right? And if it's if you can, I'm not sure, but give me a couple of things that are already public, right? So you don't need to.
Yeah, for sure.
Super cool, or that people said like, shut up and take my
money.
Yeah.
I'll give you a couple. So one that was relatively early on was LiveBlocks. And so the LiveBlocks team, Stephen and Guillaume, worked at Envision, which was a design tool when Figma came out. And so internally, they were on the team that was expected to rebuild all of Envision to take into account like real-time collaboration within the product. And that's a very hard challenge. And I believe Envision is shutting down at the end of this year. And I'm sure there were other business problems as well, but like the Figma threat was a real one for them. And so when I started playing around to talking to people, like kind of everyone had the problem of like, oh yeah, I had to add comments. And then when I added comments into my product, like then I needed to add threading to the comments. And then I needed to add attachments to the comments. And then like, it's like one of those products that sprawls and suddenly you're maintaining way more infrastructure than you thought you were. Or similarly like, oh, I'm going to add notifications. And then I need to add the logic around when I send the notifications. And so it's something that not everyone necessarily understood originally. Like you don't necessarily think everyone needs real-time cursors flying around all the time, but everyone needs this like fundamental collaboration within their SaaS and enterprise tooling. So that was one that was really easy to see. And then another one I would give you that's more relevant to platform engineering teams is Zuplo. And so Zuplo is a developer-first API gateway or a programmable API gateway. And their hypothesis was, hey, the existing API gateway market is sort of like someone calls and you go through this like long 3-month procurement process and you adopt an entire gateway at one time. And they came in and said, hey, most companies that are that early don't need something that heavy right off the bat. Like you want to rate limit one endpoint. You like have some little thing that you need to do. And a gateway would be the right long-term solution, but you don't need the full functionality today. So like, let's give you something that you can adopt incrementally yourself. And so that was one where I could call around and easily find people who were like, yeah, I had this problem, but like, I'm not going to spend 3 months setting up an entire behemoth of tooling.
No, it's like a really cool examples. And like now I know that a lot of time VCs have thesis like already, right? Like you're thinking X, Y, and Z, and this is going to be very interesting. And you're actively looking for companies. Like, is there any thesis for Boldstart, or is it more like
we generally,
everything?
We're believers that founders see around corners better than we do. So we don't have specific theses. I would say we come with a prepared mind to certain spaces. So like we see enough incoming cybersecurity companies that like we know what we've seen before. We know what we haven't seen before. We have a sense of the ecosystem. Same thing with infrastructure. Same thing with enterprise application layer. And so I wouldn't say it's that we don't have any opinions. We'll often say to someone who comes in, we can like if we're talking to a non-human identity company, we can like skip through all the pieces about how many non-human identities there are. We know that already. And so we can skip through a lot of the problem. But we're really looking for the founders to tell us about the specific solution and why that's what's going to work.
No, that makes sense. So you are seeing a lot of companies, and we're a Kubernetes podcast. What is interesting in Kubernetes, like in particular, if there's anything like you're seeing that is like super friendly or sexy or whatever?
I have to admit, I don't know why this is, and maybe I'll get great Kubernetes pitches after this. I haven't seen as much lately. Like I would say the things we've been talking about, I've seen a lot of cybersecurity. I've seen a lot around identity. I've seen a lot around generative AI. I've seen a lot kind of around some of the frontier pieces of robotics and biotechnology, but I haven't been seeing the same wave of core infrastructure companies I saw 2 or 3 years ago.
Uh-huh.
And that, I guess maybe that's something else that's also changed since Dark. I felt like at that period of time, everyone was looking at how do we do a better infrastructure play. And I feel like that's really gotten a lot quieter. And I don't really know why that is. I'd be curious if you have a hypothesis.
It's a good question. It's a really good question. Like I live and breathe Kubernetes because that's pretty much all we do. I think Kubernetes now is in some weird point that there are like too many tools, if you will. And I think the most interesting trends that I'm seeing is taking existing tools and try to teach them into Kubernetes. For example, Kafka for Kubernetes, Postgres for Kubernetes, Elasticsearch for Kubernetes. And it's like taking existing tools and putting them on Kubernetes on one side. So I think like this is a trend that I'm seeing, but it's more like an infra stateful application of Kubernetes like layer that is interesting. Cost reduction, not sure if you're seeing a lot, but like I don't know, it's not only Kubernetes, but like it's the most common thing. Like we're overspending on top of our like AWS and Kubernetes. How can we reduce the cost? So this is like very common. But again, it's part of something a bit bigger. Identity to Kubernetes, like to take your service account like problem. I think this is something that we do see, but most of the startups that I'm currently seeing are taking Kubernetes as like the layer that their application is going to serve, but not necessarily they're not trying to solve Kubernetes problems. For better or worse, like our product has only Kubernetes. But it's super interesting, like to hear like your again like view on things, and maybe there are a lot of like cool Kubernetes pitches that are waiting to happen because I think there are quite a lot of problems.
There are definitely quite a lot of problems still. I think.
Well, what you mentioned a bit like platform engineers, and we see the IDP is one of the most like interesting trends. I feel that every company that is using, again, like they're using Kubernetes, they're doing like backstage for Kubernetes with Kubernetes, but it's something quite cool. What do you think about that space of like platform engineering specific toolings? Other than IDP, I didn't really saw a lot of like success there, like specifically for platform engineers, but what's your take here?
I agree with you. Boldstart, we're investors in Rody, which is a hosted backstage product we really like and believe in. The founder, David, is great.
He's the one who founded Backstage. He created their like Backstage, didn't he?
We worked very closely with, yeah. And so when I think about that space, I think one of the challenges is as people creating platform engineering tooling, we want to set up the IDP and then just have it be like everyone just plugs their things in. But I think to some extent, it's still a human problem where you have to go around and kind of convince everyone that they want to put their service into the catalog and have everyone be able to use it. And I think, I don't know why I've noticed this, but I feel like a lot of times, like because our ideal as platform engineering teams is to have it be hands off, we tend to be like a little bit less proactive of going out and getting everyone to do those things. And I think that's a real challenge. And so I think that's maybe a cultural thing we could do within our platform engineering teams is say like, hey, yeah, we're kind of like a support and experience team, but like almost, I know this is controversial, think of ourselves in a little bit more of a salesy way of explaining to everyone why they want to use our tools. And I think having more authority to do that would certainly be helpful for platform teams. I do think one of the other interesting challenges around selling to platform teams is just if you think about an organization, the platform team is much smaller than the general engineering team. And so if you think about it from a venture capitalist mindset, if you're selling something that's going to impact every developer in a company, and like a CTO or CISO would think of this as being, this is a developer-focused tool, that's a much larger set of people. If you're saying, hey, the platform team is going to buy this, I'd be curious to hear from people if anyone wants to contact me after kind of how you think about your budget around platform teams. But that's definitely something we found is a more challenging space compared to some other areas of technical tooling.
What was doing? I think it's, again, like we're facing it a bit ourselves. Like we sell to platform engineers, a product that helps to the entire organization. I think platform engineers in most companies don't really have a budget per se. Like sometimes they are part of the infrastructure team and then no problem. Like infrastructure doesn't have a budget. Sometimes they are part of like the SRE team and they're already paying like Datadog $2 million or whatever. So we already have like quite a big budget. But when it comes to a tool that is only internal and it doesn't fall in that buckets of like, it's an infrastructure or it's a monitoring, it becomes much more trickier, right? Because you need to invent a budget and it's always hard to invent a budget than to reallocate like existing budget.
Yes, for sure. Especially like it's very easy when you're just subbing one line item of, oh, we're a better version of this tool. And like you mentioned before about cloud costs, that's been a huge thing. I feel like one of the number one things I hear in board meetings right now is around, you named one of the companies earlier, but there's certain companies where the infrastructure pieces just get very expensive over time. And so everyone's kind of looking at how they can bring that back down and get it under control. And I think that's partially just the macroeconomic climate of everyone's being a lot more cost conscious as an organization overall. And I think it's also just some of the tooling just costs more as your organization grows and as the volume of data you're working with grows.
Okay. Well, I agree. Let me ask you something like a bit different, like on a personal note. You are a founder, CEO, super technical company. Now you're a PC. Are you going to be a founder like in 2 years? If I'm going to interview you, are you going to be a founder? Are you missing that? Like, what do you think about doing that transition?
Yeah, it's an interesting transition. It's a very different job. I think of joining a partnership the same way I think founders think it. Like I tell every founder, if you're going to solve this problem and you want to be a venture-backed company, you should love this problem enough to do it for 10 years. And joining a partnership is the same thing. You're backing founders and saying, hey, I'm going to be on your board. I'm going to be in this journey with you. And I would never say that to someone and then leave after 2 years. Like I promised to them that I'll be there with them for 10 years. And sort of every new company I back, that like re-ups me for another 10 years. And so I think a lot of operators and founders who go into venture, if you're going to decide it's not the right fit, the time to do that is in the first couple of years. I think the first couple of years, you also get some of the best parts where it's like new and exciting and you have a backlog of companies you're excited to back. And you get some of the challenging parts of like, oh, things starting not to work out, or maybe there's like a dry part of the market where you feel like you aren't doing as many deals as you want. And so I think you see the whole range in the first couple of years, but then you really only hone it and go through the whole process with people over 10, 20. So I think in 2 more years, hopefully I'll have slightly more nuanced takes for you on venture and hopefully some new trends and maybe we'll have solved some of our Kubernetes problems, but I'll still be here at Boldstart.
Okay. No, that's a good answer. And maybe like to end it again, our listener, like platform engineers, let's say that they have this idea, something that you didn't hear around Kubernetes. They are now just waiting to pitch to you, and they also think that they can make money out of it, which is great. And what would you say is like the main thing that they should come prepared with, like other than the money? They are like, yeah, my company is willing to pay us $1 million for something that will solve, I don't know, like Kubernetes, identity, whatever. What are the main things when I come to pitch to you that I should have other than that, other than like the
Oh yeah, this is
some basic.
This is unique to me. You don't even need to have that much to come to me. Like frankly, if someone's sitting here listening and saying, I have 3 different ideas that I've solved internally and I would like an external perspective on which one I should build a company around, send me an email. That's totally fine. That would be working at inception. If I'm thinking about what you would need to get to the point where we're all ready to go, I think you would have to have that conviction and like, okay, this is what I'm going to do. This is who I'm going to work with. This is like the big market we're going after. And so like, I think it's actually more about how confident the founder feels in the direction they want to take. And if I believe in that same version of the future and if my partners do as well, because every founder deserves investors who are really aligned with them and want to go in the same direction. There's nothing that's more destructive than having like a board that's pulling against itself.
No, yeah, that makes sense. So you are saying that if I solve 3 interesting problems, I should just reach out to you, even if I don't have the revenue plan or whatever.
Yeah, totally fine. That's going to vary. Okay. Some people like to see a lot more before they want to talk to a founder, but like I also just love interesting technology. And so if it's sort of like early thinking around like I solved this problem for us, I think other people have this problem. Have you heard about it? Like those are interesting conversations.
No, sounds great. I think that we talked like it was a very unconventional episode, but I think super interesting one for our customers, for our users, listeners. And I'd be happy to hear from you, like maybe last final remarks, things that I missed that you like to talk about.
Yeah, I mean, this just came up from what we were just talking about. I think the other piece of it is not every platform engineer necessarily wants to be a founder, but I think every platform engineer is thinking about what tooling they want to use. And so VCs, like, sure, our big role in the industry is to fund new and interesting things. But we also spend a lot of time working with people who are buyers or users of technology to kind of help. My husband jokes that I'm a human router to help people find the right things. And so people have big outstanding questions of like, hey, I'm really looking for something to solve this problem. Shoot me a note. I'm also happy to answer those and try to help you find something if I know of companies in that space. But overall, yeah, I'm just really motivated by more people being able to build software. I think we're like at a really interesting moment in how that's changing. I think it might look quite different in a couple of years. And so I'm really just interested to see what happens next.
Okay. Alan, it's been a pleasure. I really enjoyed like having you in the show. And I think it's very interesting like we're talking a lot with platform engineers, but here in the other side, how do like platform engineering tools are getting funded and how the VC work is like super interesting and relevant. And yeah, I think with that we'll conclude. So thanks a lot,
Yeah,
Ellen.
thank you for having me.